Slobodan Milosevic, former president of Serbia and Yugoslavia, is the first head of state to be tried by an international court on charges of war crimes and genocide. Milosevic had already launched 2 wars against Croatia and Bosnia to secure his vision of a Yugoslavia dominated by Serbs. Now, in March 1999, his forces were terrorizing Kosovo, part of his own country, where the majority of the people were ethnic Albanians. As his forces intensified their 3rd campaign of ethnic cleansing, the Western powers united against him. They issued an ultimatum. Milosevic was required to give Kosovo, a province of Serbia, self-government under the protection of NATO troops. As the deadline approached, the chairman of the European Union went to talk him round.
Ich habe da noch mal mit ihm unter 4 Augen gesprochen, habe ihm inständig gebeten, zu begreifen, dass dies zu einem Krieg führt mit den USA. Ich habe ihm gesagt, dass es Wahnsinn ist, was er tut, Jugoslawien, Serbien in einen Krieg mit den USA zu führen. Ich habe ihm gesagt, Deutschland es zweimal gemacht hat und es war zweimal ein Riesendesaster, dass er das doch aus der Geschichte lernen soll.
We are defending ourselves. I think we are defending the right to be free and to be independent and right to live in peace.
Er hat mir damals zu verstehen gegeben, dass er diese westlichen Politiker alle nicht ernst nimmt.
The last effort was made by America's special envoy.
I was asked to go back and to give Milosevic a very clear message that if he didn't accept the Rambouillet agreements, we would bomb.
He spelled out what would happen in a meeting with President Milosevic and his number 2, the president of Serbia.
On je posle ušao kod Miloševića I objašnjavao mu da praktično su rakete toliko precizne da mu go pogoda ovaj sto I da tu mi nemamo šta da tražimo I tako dalje.
Milosevic looked almost disinterested in it, sort of moving his head to the side, just kind of shaking his head in disgust.
He said, well, that's nothing I can do. I'm not going to sign.
Ambassador Holbrooke walked out of the room, was walking across the large reception area, and he just flashed a thumbs down and shook his head.
Naravno, ja sam ga ispratio I zamolio O'Briena, odnosno moj stafa, javi nam kad će biti da znamo da se sklonimo.
Las noticias que yo recibía de las conversaciones con Dick eran muy negativas y decidimos en el Consejo Atlántico prepararnos para lo peor. Me pidieron que hablara con todos los países.
I was in the White House when he called. I felt very strongly that we had to move quickly. We couldn't have another Bosnia where the international community and Europe and NATO in particular kind of fiddled around for 2.5 years.
Y por lo tanto, la pregunta que yo formulé es si, de acuerdo con usted o con su gobierno, ¿cree usted que hay una base legal?
I said yes, and when I authorized the use of force, I said emphatically yes.
Are you ready to go with us, Tony? And I said yes, without hesitation.
Ils étaient tous mis d'accord, c'est Milosevic qui a refusé. À partir de là, les choses étaient jouées.
The squadron commander pulled the entire squadron into the briefing room. Pilots, maintenance professionals, everybody in the squadron pulled them together and said, boys, we're going to war.
Kada je bombardovanje počelo, ja sam, da budem iskreno, mislila će trajati samo jednu noć. Da ćemo sutra da se vratimo normalnom životu i svojim kućama. Nisam verovala da će trajati 24 sata. 3 dana bi mi bila strašno mnogo.
Everybody was talking 3 days. And all the pilots were telling me, you got to get me in, you got to get me in, because I need to go, I want to go and bomb before the war is over.
The first night, we didn't get a knockout blow on the Serb air defense. It didn't come up. We shot down 3 MiGs. The second night, we didn't get any MiGs, and they also didn't bring up the air defense. So we began to realize we had trouble. The third night, there was bad weather. The fourth night was a Saturday night. We lost an F-117, and all the missions got scrubbed. So it was pretty clear by Sunday and Monday that we weren't going to get a knockout blow.
What made matters worse was the reaction of Serbia's traditional ally, Russia. Hardliners in Moscow were trying to use popular support for the Serbs to undermine their government's pro-Western policies.
Во-первых, когда были митинги протеста напротив американского посольства, я подъезжал туда. Правда, был в гражданской форме, и я восхищался нашими молодыми ребятами, студентами прежде всего, которые агрессию оценивают именно как агрессию.
Only 2 hours before the bombing had begun, President Clinton had phoned to inform the ailing President Yeltsin that NATO was about to take unilateral action.
Я сказал, что столько мы вдвоем наработали с точки зрения безопасности, с точки зрения разоружения, и сейчас все пойдет на смарку.
And I argued to him, you know, we actually took a lot of heat off of Russia by having NATO do this. I went through all the steps that the warnings Milosevic had been given, the opportunities that we had that were blown to avoid any kind of conflict in Kosovo months before it actually materialized.
Президент сказал, нечего мне с ним разговаривать. Действительно была по-хорошему внутренняя обида, потому что поставили, по сути дела, нас перед фактом.
The one man who thought he could talk Yeltsin round was the French president.
J'ai beaucoup d'estime et d'amitié pour Boris Yeltsin. Alors quand je l'ai appelé, il a explosé.
Et le président Yeltsin s'exprimait d'une voix de tonnerre, littéralement, et en russe. Et le président de la République n'avait pas besoin d'avoir l'appareil collé à l'oreille.
Ну, короче говоря, грубейшая ошибка американцев и американской дипломатии и Клинтона. Грубейшая ошибка.
Президент наш тогда вообще обвинил Ширака в том, что он является едва ли не пособником, и ему придется отвечать перед международным трибуналом.
Мы прекратили отношения с НАТО. Вы знаете, были подготовлены и затем вышли наши разведывательные корабли в район конфликта. По военной линии были приведены в состояние более высокой боевой готовности.
The Serb army were doing quite well on their own. They had mastered some of the techniques needed to outwit NATO's airmen.
Znali smo da oni raspolažu koordinatama, da će oni to iskoristiti, da prve rakete koje krenu prema našoj zemlji, da će ići upravo na te ciljeve. Dakle, mi smo to izmestili sve iz tih objekata. Ti objekti su, kao što znate, uništeni, ali nije uništena ni vojska, niti naoružanje.
The Serbs had more tricks up their sleeves.
Pošto smo znali da oni imaju inteligentne bombe, mi smo koje reaguju i na toplotni izvor i na pojedine odsjaje metala, mi smo koristeći dostignuća naših instituta te drvene makete premazivali posebnim hemikalijama koje su odavale odsjaj metala, a imitirali su radarske izvore zračenja. Inteligentne rakete koje su bile specijalno namenjene za uništavanje radarskih sistema i radarske posluge, u suštini vredne po $1–2 miliona pogađale uređaje koji nisu koštali više od $50.
The West had gone to war to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. Milosevic's forces responded by stepping up their campaign to drive the Kosovo Albanians out.
Pa tu je najvažnije bilo za što kraće vreme neutralisati pre svega šiptarske terorističke snage i ne dozvoliti da to preraste u masovnu oružanu pobunu.
A week into the war, the Serb special police reached the area of Miliševo. Bali Thaci taught science in a local school there. In 9 months, his family had been forced to move home 5 times. Fearing that the approaching Serbs would kill the able-bodied men, Thaci hid in the forest, leaving his wife and children with the family car.
Kështu që pasi që mor një farë informate vogël që janë tërheq forcat serbe nga ajo pjesë, atëherë u detyruam që të afrohemi disi me frigë, por nga ajo se duhet të dishim diçka se çka ka ndodhur me familjet tona.
He had hidden his video camera under a barrel outside a friend's house. Now he returned to collect it.
Por kishte 20 minuta dikun që ishin tërheq forcat serbe nga ajo shtëpia ku kisha mshefun kamerën dhe shtëpia ishte duke u djegur. Në momente ku morr kamerën atje që për fat kishte shpëtuar, disa njerëz që kishin ardhur aty po më thonë, "O bali vrapo që kanë se ishte një civil i vram." Më vajti mendja që duhesh në ato të dokumentoheshin.
With his camera, Bali made a unique record of Serb ethnic cleansing. Next, he made for the place where he was told the Serbs had caught up with the people fleeing from his village.
Atë racisht I pash 2 gra, plaka që kishin mbet aty dhe nuk e kishin marrë forcat serbe me veti.
Që këtu edhe I kanë marrën këta, popullin shkajnë kanë, ne kanë marrë me traktora, e të sfirat, e të gju për mi, sa kanë mujt, e të gju për mi. Mi, kjerë, e të sfiratën, e ilëshunë sfirenja, të I kanë tretën për kjerë.
5 men among the fleeing villagers had been killed on the spot. And Bali found his family's red Volkswagen Golf abandoned.
Unë llogarica që e kam të humbur tër familjen atëherë, edhe për vetveten më nuk isha interesuar. Pastaj në gjendje çfarishëm dëgjova fjalë se në fshatin Borim që ndodha një masakër e madhe. Unë parandjeja se aty ishin strehu familjet e dajve të mi.
Milosevic's police were still combing the area. To avoid them, he took the long way round to the village.
Mora rrugë, ku dikon afër 3 orë, kam bëu tim për shku deri te vendi I ngjarjes. Kur ju afrova vendit ngjarjes, masakrës aty afër fshatit Borim, takova një shoktimin Bajramin, Bajramorinën.
Nuk di si ta emërtoj një tragjedi. Nuk është tragjedi, nuk është komedi. Ndoshta për dikën mund të jetë një komedi.
Nga momenti kur e pash, vrejta se ish njëri në afekt, ish një aspekt psikologjik shumë vështirë dhe shumë tron.
Among the mutilated corpses, Bali's friend had found his own brother. It was too much for him.
Kishin njerëz të djegur, kish njerëz me kokë të qame që i kishin nxjerrë trunin dhe e kishin masakruar në mënyrë sa më banale, si them. Zgjidhet vetë sot kur nala nga kjo pozitë ka mund ta bëj. Po kur kam lëshu kamerën të nqezoj, nuk e kam ndërprej. Që sot nga kjo pozitë të mos dikush që kur të shpalosin ato që është një montim apo është diçka tjetër.
At the site of this massacre, Bali filmed 36 bodies. Among them was his uncle.
E kom gjeru dajen, po nuk e kom njoft. E kom gjeru, po se kom njoft që është ai daja im. Nga ajo se çfarë i kishin bërë, kishin qa fytin shto dhe kishin nxjerr atë nga bsherën, që me siguri e kanë marrë trofej me vete me çu atje më mburr në Serbi.
Ending the catastrophe that had struck people like these was NATO's war aim. But its targets in the first phase of the bombing were not the police units who were to blame. They were Serb air defense installations, and only enough of them for a 3-day war.
All the target sets that were given had been hit. So there weren't any approved targets to go hit anymore unless we went out there and struck the same targets again, which in fact is what we did. We just turned basically bigger rocks into smaller rocks.
The NATO commander had a problem. To enlarge the range of targets he could attack, he needed approval from all 19 NATO countries.
Pues me decía, me insistía que era necesario pasar a bombardear algunos edificios que tuvieran valor simbólico o valor psicológico para Milosevic y de esa manera intentar romper su espina dorsal desde el punto de vista psicológico.
We had to strike at the Serb means of transportation, including their highway network, their rail network, their tunnels, and so forth, and especially the highly significant bridges over the Danube River.
Y yo le dije, pues esto va a ser muy difícil. Varios ministros y varios jefes de gobierno, como sabes, les va a costar mucho aceptar que tomar esta decisión.
They both knew who he meant.
Clark voulait absolument détruire tous les ponts de Belgrade, ce qui était évidemment absurde et pas du tout nécessaire dans le cadre de la mission qui était la nôtre.
President Chirac left for his Easter break, but President Clinton tracked him down.
Je passais en effet 2 ou 3 jours dans un chalet en montagne et qu'il avait fait venir 2 ou 3 techniciens américains pour organiser une conversation protégée, et ça n'a pas marché. Bref, on a fini par prendre le téléphone ordinaire.
President Chirac said quite understandably that if you hit them where they live, if you sort of try to break down the economic infrastructure of Belgrade and with it Serbia, after all these sanctions, you'll just make them more angry.
Je considérais que cela ne servait à rien, que cela consistait à punir les Serbes et que cela ne servait à rien pour détruire le régime de Milosevic.
I disagreed to the extent that I said, look, I think this bombing campaign can work, but we have to be able to have enough muscle to have impact.
Je lui dis qu'il me semblait que notre objectif, ce n'était pas de faire la guerre au sens traditionnel du terme, c'était d'anéantir les capacités de commandement de Milosevic.
Chirac's words gave Clinton an opening. They agreed NATO could bomb targets related to Milosevic's command capability in Belgrade.
Operaciones muy específicas, muy concretas sobre algunos edificios que pudieran tener ese valor simbólico sobre Milosevic.
Here's the two targets. It's the Serb Ministerial Specialist Police. Here's the Yugoslav Ministerial Specialist Police. Both headquarters are in Belgrade. Both are involved in directing the ethnic cleansing. I want to strike both of them.
I mi smo čuli sirene. I onda sam čuo sa tranzistora taj glas, građani, dolaze avioni, napašće vas, isključite struju, otvorite prozore, idite u najbliže sklonište. I sećam se, mi smo, odjednom je bio tajac. I niko od nas nije znao šta će napasti avion, ko će da pogine.
The strikes were effective, they were precise, there were no civilian injuries, there were no collateral damages, and it sent a resounding signal of NATO's resolve.
That same night, the 11th of the war, NATO sidestepped the French veto. General Clark bombed 2 bridges across the Danube, but not in Belgrade. Chirac's prediction came true. The bombing rallied the Serbs behind Milosevic. Targets became the latest Belgrade fashion accessory.
Odbrana mostova je naša ideja. Onda smo mi se dogovorili da svake večeri naši članovi, aktivisti i simpatizeri budu na mostovima. I tako smo se rasporedili da je svake večeri jedna grupa ljudi bila na jednom od 3 mostova. Naravno, onda su počeli da se tome priključuju i drugi.
Znam da su svi protiv Srbije, ali Srbima dozlogrdilo je. Znam da postoji dogovor s nebom, ko tebe kamenom, ti njega hlebom, ali dokle tako, ali dokle tako.
Even Belgrade's westernized sophisticates, who watched the BBC on satellite, fell in behind Milosevic.
Suffering of the refugees displaced by
Oni se šetaju bez granica. Da pokažu da ima 42 miliona šiftara.
Kad god ne znaš šta će nužno refugees. A oni su živjeli tako, oni žive tako i ovako. Ko? Refugees. Oni žive u normalnom životu ovako kao i po šatoru. U zemljani, ovo sad bolje žive.
Ovo je sve snimci.
200,000 of Muslims.
Milosevic too dismissed the plight of the refugees.
You are right, there are a lot of refugees, but they are result of bombing. And they are not only Albanians. Everybody is running away because of bombing. Serbs, Turks, Gypsy, Muslims, deers are running, birds are running, everybody is running away because of bombing. Bees are running.
President Milosevic gave no other televised interview during the war. He spent most of his time inside his palatial compound in a suburb of Belgrade. he neither visited the wounded nor toured areas hit by bombs. From these grand rooms, he directed the campaign against the Kosovar Albanians and against his political enemies at home.
Za to vrijeme sam ja naravno bio u Beogradu i menjao sam prenoćište. Tada sam dobio informaciju da je formirana jedna specijalna grupa u Zemunu sa namjerom da nekoliko ljudi ubije i da su na dva prva mesta, da smo ja i Slavko Ćuruvija.
10 days into the war, the two men at the top of the hit list met in central Belgrade.
Ujutro je bilo možda 11 sati, bilo je sunčano i bilo je sve potpuno prazno. To je bio kao da je izumro, kao da je kuga u Beogradu. Bili su jedno 20 ili 30 stolova postavljeni sa stolnjacima, peljarama, ali nije bilo nijednog gosta.
The man he was meeting was newspaper owner Slavko Ćuruvija. His paper, The Telegraph, had been closed down by the regime and its offices ransacked after he waged a campaign against Milosevic's new censorship law. Previously, he had counted Milosevic's wife as a valued contact.
When I met her last time, on a day when they passed that crazy and unconstitutional law, I said, look, Mira, this is very bad. This is dictatorship. She said, we should have done it 3 years ago.
In the deserted cafe, the publisher, the opposition leader and their wives compared notes.
Tako da su raspravljali koje mogućnosti njih dvojica imaju da te opasne situacije izbegnu. Slavko ga jednom trenutku pitao, jeli, a šta ćeš ti da uradiš?
On rekao, mene su čak iz porodice Miloševića savjetovali da napustim zemlju i da odem u Crnu Goru.
But he stayed in Belgrade. The next weekend, he and his wife went out for Sunday lunch.
Mi smo odlučili da idemo da šetamo, prosto ne možete stalno u kući da sedite. I onda se tamo kod Dunavskog keja popeli na Kalemegdan kod Svete Petke. Što je bio Uskrs, bili su vernici po crkvi. I pri izlasku iz Kalemegdana već je bilo negdje blizu 4 popodne. Kad smo se vraćali u kući, ušli na prolaz. I neka tutnjavina. Dešava. On je pao i spustio mi ruku, ja sam se poluokrenula i na jedan put vidjela nekog mladog čoveka obučenog u crno, crno delo, crna kapa, belo, bledo, lice, bezlično. A ovaj drugi je prišao mi s leđa i udario me pištoljem u glavu i ja sam pala kod Slavka i tek onda sam čula pucnje. I dok sam ležala do njega, ovaj je prišao i pucao mu je u glavu.
Several hundred attended Ćuruvija's funeral, including the man whose name was next on the hit list.
Onda sam otišao kući da spakujem stvari i došao mi jedan komšija, to je bilo 2 ili 3 ujutru, pozvonio mi neko na vrata, ja sam otvorio, bio jedan komšija koji je mi rekao, ja sam šetam psa po parku i park je pun ljudi koji razgovaraju na motorolama, civilu, u svakom grmu je po jedan ili dvojica. I to je bio znak da je posljednji trenutak. Taj dan na sahranu smo pripremili plan odlaska za Crnu Goru kolima. Na granici Crne Gore su znali ovi crnogorski da treba ja da prođem i oni nas nisu zaustavljali i mi smo prošli naprosto kroz tu, nismo se zaustavljali.
The Republic of Montenegro was Serbia's junior partner in the Yugoslav Federation.
Obezbijeđen je jedan bezbjedan transfer gospodina Đinđića iz Beograda i obezbijeđeno je sve ono što mu je ovdje omogućavalo potpunu zaštitu i omogućavalo da može organizovati kako tako normalan život.
Milo Đukanović had become president of Montenegro by opposing Milosevic. He tried to stay out of Milosevic's conflict with NATO.
President Đukanović clearly was not very keen on being bombed in the same way as we were bombing Belgrade and parts of Kosovo. You can see why. He was not in sympathy with Milosevic at all, but it was necessary to take out some of the air defense capabilities of Yugoslavia that were based in Montenegro.
Les militaires de l'OTAN voulaient bombarder le Monténégro. Je ne le voulais pas. J'ai donc dit à Bill Clinton, j'ai appelé Bill Clinton pour lui dire que bombarder le Monténégro, c'était en réalité faire le jeu de Milosevic en affaiblissant le président Đukanović.
The president told Chirac that we simply had no choice, that there was too much of a risk to our own pilots and our own military people to give sanctuary to the Serb forces that were using Montenegro as a base.
We got to look at the targets. If we can hit targets with a high level of certainty that we're not going after civilians, but that will go to the heart of what they're doing, then we ought not to rule any targets off the list.
Chirac backed down on condition that the bombing of Montenegro was restricted to limited strikes on Serb military targets. Soon after, NATO launched a huge bombing raid. The French president demanded an explanation.
Le président Clinton avait, semble-t-il, des informations selon lesquelles le président Đukanović lui-même souhaitait des bombardements pour se débarrasser d'éléments favorables à Milosevic.
Je lui ai dit, ça m'étonnerait beaucoup, mais je vais le vérifier. Finalement, j'ai réussi à le joindre sur son portable.
Gospodin Chirac provjerava tačnost nekih navoda sa kojima je on valjda raspolagao, međutim, moj odgovor na to je bio potpuno eksplicitan. Svaka bomba koja je tih dana pala na teritoriju Crne Gore je zapravo prijetila da ozbiljno potkopa poziciju vlasti u Crnoj Gori.
Et donc je l'ai confirmé à mon tour à Bill Clinton et cette affaire a été réglée.
Soon after, NATO raids on Montenegro were stopped. Serbia's leaders were more single-minded in selecting targets. A month into the war, more than 500,000 Kosovars, a third of the population, had been driven from their homes.
Ja sam se nagledao mnogo žena koje su nosile male bebe u naručju i išle peške po velikim vrućinama. Meni je strašno bilo krivo, meni su suze išle. Ja sam plakao. I stalno sam govorio, ovo srpskom vojniku nikad nije trebalo, ovo srpska vojska nikad nije radila, ovo je velika sramota za nas.
Amongst those on the roads was Bali Thaci, searching for his family.
Kur kom afro vendit aty ku kam lënë familjen time, në shpat kështu kom pa atje në lug. Çdo gjë e heshtur, çdo gjë e djegun përreth. Asnjë njeri nuk kom pa.
In fact, his wife, Elmira, who was 9 months pregnant, had fled with their 3 children. She was as afraid for her husband as he was for her.
Kur e ktheshëm kryt anena ku e lam Balien, krejt flok theshe I ka hi krejt, se dhe u kallk edhe 2 turjaka, 2 fshatra anena përpjet, e kerre traktura krejt që kushin pas shti flokën. Ta dhe për ti t'shin thëmija babi amet atje.
Before leaving, the women prepared for the worst.
Unë shkova në Kerr, thash me marrë diçka për mu duk pak si ma e vjetër. Kom vesh 2 vinjaka kështu, se ato bash që ato shka ishin 7 zona, që ato si ma treja, që ato I maltreteshin ma tepër.
The police caught the fleeing villagers in this clearing and marched them off at gunpoint.
Kem shkel në për gjak, unë e vetë, edhe vjera, edhe na shkajna kona, kem shkel në për gjak gjenve.
They were herded onto buses and driven into the mountains towards Albania.
Tu në kufetane, na kanë la shumë largë. Na shdrypën aty, shdrypni sa më të shpejt, kur gjahe ishtë të ngellët, pa buk 4 dita, sa u banë ma, hiq pa hangër. Kem pushu unë e vetë edhe vjera, kom të ma janë së në heqna. Thash ty në hesni, thash të si.
Stumbling and in pain, they reached the border.
Sikur mizat, milicia. Kem sa që aty pa dojnë më na mytë. Kër e nisën më na bon kom se shishëm, të ambike shi jetë terri madhë, kom shtur zhup në për saqme të këtyne, s'pa di që me tha, fisheke këtu, orme, shtut kështu në asfalt ishin pas kom. Në kena thonë që aty kanë më na mytë, sa të him që aty.
They made it to Albania, and Elmia gave birth to a girl. But she was born with suspected brain damage due to malnutrition.
A lot of people who were opposed to any action in Kosovo and against Serbia were saying, you guys have caused this. So we were getting huge heat and pressure on that.
Is the Prime Minister aware that the absolute human calamity that we see on our screens every day has got much worse since the bombing began?
The death and destruction is being wrought by Milosevic on innocent Kosovo Albanian people. He is the person who began this policy of ethnic cleansing. We are trying to put a stop to it.
Stopping ethnic cleansing from 15,000 feet was not easy. Even with the most accurate targeting technology mankind had ever used, mistakes did happen. 3 weeks into the war, foreign journalists who had been restricted to Belgrade were shepherded to Kosovo to witness a terrible scene.
NATO, fašisti su napali bombardovanjem kolonu izbeglica koji su bežali I tom prilikom su povredili I uništili, odnosno usmrtili 19 lica.
NATO had mistaken the column of Kosovo Albanian refugees for a Serb army convoy. When all the bodies were discovered, the number of dead was 73.
Can you deny that NATO was responsible for the incident or incidents which are being shown on Serbian television and to which Western correspondents were invited to go and look at headless bodies and so on, which appeared to have occurred on the road between Jakovica and Prizren? Can you deny that?
Doug, I have no indication at the present time that NATO was responsible for any...
Was it the one that is being shown on, for which you are being blamed?
Protests against the bombing campaign spread across Europe. Milosevic turned the screw.
When our soldiers are dying, they know why they are dying. They are dying for their homeland, for their fatherland. And for what will die your soldiers? 5,000 miles from home, killing children until they sleep, killing women and girls and peaceful citizens, and ruining what we were building through the decades after Second World War.
In London, the Prime Minister phoned President Clinton.
I said to him, look, we're losing this. We're losing the propaganda battle. I mean, we're losing it big time. Bill, this is like, you know, you and I are familiar with this, is like fighting a political campaign. You've got to have a proper, you know, press war room, propaganda war room, where you're putting out the correct information, you're correcting the lies of your opponents, you're setting the agenda.
He took his press advisor to NATO headquarters in Brussels to improve the press operation there.
For me at that point, it was a very low point in one sense, but in another sense, I was absolutely determined then that we see this thing through.
The Prime Minister went off to meet the general running the war.
I brought Prime Minister Blair into the office. We had a one-on-one scheduled, and he sat down on the sofa, and I said, well, can I get you a cup of tea or coffee or something? He said, no. I said, I've got a briefing here. He said, let me ask you a question.
I thought I might as well just come to the point, because it wasn't going well from the outside. So I said to him, are we going to win this thing?
Nobody had asked this question, not of me. And I said, Prime Minister, I've never lost anything significant in my life, and we're not going to lose this one.
Well, are we going to do it by air power alone? To which he said, well, we can't be sure of that.
He said, because the future of every government and leader, or almost every government leader in Western Europe, depends on this.
I then said to him, well, let's, you know, let's cut straight to the point. Are we going to need ground troops?
We might.
Well, if that's the case, then we better start preparing for that.
For that, Prime Minister, I'll probably have to depend on you. Prime Minister, thank you so much for coming.
If ground troops were needed, Tony Blair would have to bring about a sea change in the thinking of all NATO governments. A month into the war, NATO held its 50th birthday party. President Clinton was the host. The last thing he wanted was a violent public clash amongst his fellow NATO leaders, some of whom feared that backing a ground war could bring down their governments.
Noi, il governo italiano, rese noto sia al presidente Clinton e io ai membri del gruppo di contatto che il governo italiano non avrebbe mai accettato l'invio di una forza di terra nel Kosovo.
Deutschland, und zwar nicht nur wegen Rot-Grün, sondern die Stimmung im Lande war so, dass es auch für eine andere Konstellation sehr schwer geworden wäre. Die Stimmung in Deutschland insgesamt war sehr, sehr schwierig. Und das hängt mit unserer historischen Erfahrung zusammen. Vor allen Dingen die ältere Generation, die den Krieg noch erlebt hat.
For Tony Blair, the only hope of persuading them all to back the ground troops option was to win over Bill Clinton.
I was worried that the people in the Congress who did not support what I was doing, most of whom were Republicans, not in my party, and not subject to my persuasion, would actually more vocally oppose our involvement and try to stop, pass some resolution to say no ground troops can go.
Blair had come to Washington 2 days before the summit to bend the president's ear.
When they arrived at the White House, we all gathered. It was a fairly small group of Blair's very closest advisors and just a handful of us with the president.
To avoid a direct disagreement with the Prime Minister, the president had his national security advisor speak for him. He argued that they must not raise the ground troops issue at the summit meeting.
We had some very shaky reads at that stage, leaders under enormous pressure to try to end this. It was not the place to show Milosevic that we were divided. There was only one way Slobodan Milosevic could win this war, and that was to break the unity of the alliance.
I said, look, this will be a shorter campaign if he knows we have the total will to win. If he believes that we're prepared to use ground troops, to do whatever it takes to make him back down, then he is going to back down quickly.
From the air, we had 1,000 to 1 advantage. And it was a matter of time until we wore down Milosevic. Once we had 100,000 or 200,000 troops on the ground in Serbia, in those mountains, it was not 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1 advantage.
Sandy's point was, look, you know, it's all very well for you guys, but it's the Americans who are going to have to provide a lot of the hardware for this, and troops themselves.
It was clear the ground troops issue could not be settled by committee.
Bill Clinton said to me, well, look, why don't we just go up to my study and have a talk about it all? And I said to him, are we prepared to lose?
First of all, I told him that I was quite sure it would lead to a deep division in America at this time. One that I was fully willing to absorb if necessary, but that I didn't think that we needed the ground troops to win.
You may not need to use them, but you do need to threaten to use them.
We came up with this language that said, we're going to do whatever it takes to win.
Whatever it takes to win, a phrase high on determination but low on specifics, was a slogan they could all unite behind.
They took that message into the NATO meeting the next day. 19 leaders seated around a table, not in a conference call, not on a cable, not to their foreign ministers, looking at each other in the eye and essentially making a personal commitment to each other that NATO will not lose.
Мы в России рассчитывали, что будет, по крайней мере, определенное неудовлетворение, недовольство или хотя бы активное неучастие в этой акции.
If NATO did go on to defeat Russia's ally, Yeltsin's government would be in peril. He used a television appearance to announce a surprise initiative.
Мы готовы быть посредниками. Готовы. Между Соединенными Штатами, между НАТО, между Югославией.
В этой ситуации надо было говорить с тем, кто принимает решения, с тем, кто является главным в этой акции. Не НАТО, а именно Соединенные Штаты Америки.
The final speeches were being made when we got word that President Yeltsin was on the line. We pulled the president out of the meeting. It was clear that Yeltsin had something on his mind. And the single message that he wanted to try to get across and kept coming back to and back to was, Bill, we've got to fix this problem. We've got to fix this problem.
He went on and on about it. You know, he was mad at Milosevic too. I mean, he had tried to talk sense to him and had certainly not wanted another round of ethnic cleansing.
So Yeltsin said, you know, Bill, I want to work with you on this new diplomatic effort to bring about an end to the war. But I need a bombing pause. I need to be able to show that Russia has some influence.
My view was that Milosevic had to cry uncle first, that, you know, we may have to talk to him, but first of all, there had to be a clear, unambiguous defeat for the aggression forces in Kosovo.
Он сказал, что я был очень возмущен и страшно расстроен. Он действительно был страшно расстроен. Все-таки Ельцин человек концентричный, достаточно сильный, и он не очень часто получал «нет».
Though playing a weak hand, Yeltsin now planned a political masterstroke. To extend Russia's influence in the Balkans, he called in his former prime minister, who he knew was well trusted in the West.
Он мне сам предложил, что тебе не позаниматься каким-то отдельными вопросами. Я говорю, пожалуйста. Я готов любыми отдельными поручениями, только без должности, без ничего. Пожалуйста, я готов.
President Clinton also called on a trusted colleague. 30 years earlier, Strobe Talbot and Bill Clinton, the one with the beard, had arrived in Oxford together. Now, Talbot was the president's Russian expert. Together, they set out the conditions the joint peace mission must impose on Milosevic.
Those conditions are that his forces have to get out of Kosovo. He's got to let an international presence, which, by the way, is going to be led by NATO, into Kosovo, and the refugees have to come home. And until those conditions are met, the bombing is going to continue.
A week later, President Yeltsin's envoy arrived in Washington. Talbot presented him with the terms.
По сути дела, предлагалась оккупация Косово. Мы с этим не могли согласиться.
Agreeing peace terms to put to Milosevic would not be easy, but before the Russians and Americans could get down to work, events in Serbia intervened. That same week, over Serbia's third biggest city, Niš, NATO decided to use a controversial weapon. Cluster bombs had been ruled out by the NATO commander in Bosnia as too prone to kill people. But the current NATO commander had a different view.
Cluster bomb units are the right munitions to go after certain targets. Like in the case of Niš, what you had was the dispersion of the helicopter force and some of the aircraft outside the bounds of the airfield hangars. And the cluster bomb unit is the appropriate area weapon to use. It disperses explosives over a very large area.
Liliana Spasic, a medical student, was in Niš on the day of the bombing, staying with her in-laws.
7. mjesec je bila trudnoće. Čekali smo to, unuče, da se poigramo, da se zabavimo malo i mi. I ajde, pošla sam na pijac. U zadnjem momentu i Snaja je rekla, čekaj me, kaže, i ja ću da pođem s tobom, da se prošetam. Kad smo stigli blizu te ulice, poviše nas se otvorio taj padobran kako, pa onda te sitne bombice. Vidim, ljudi beže. To je palo. Baš u centar. Snaja se okrenula i samo je rekla, jaoj mama. Ja sam nju zagrlila i rekla sam, ne boj se. Nas dve smo se srušile.
Within minutes, the mayor arrived at the scene.
Strašna slika. U jednoj ulici je bilo 5 leševa. Ljudi u panici. Lokva krvi s jednog mesta gdje su čoveka već pomerili.
I onda sam zvala u pomoć. Ljudi u pomoć, spasite mi Snaju trudnicu. Sve gori, sve u plamenu. Ja se opet onesvestim. Kad je došla hitna pomoć da me uzme, ja sam rekla, neću. Meni ostavite, ja hoću da umrem. Spasite mi Snaju.
Mrs. Spasic was taken to hospital, where her leg was amputated. She did not know that by the side of the road, her daughter-in-law lay dead.
We'd used these weapons before. Some 1,400 had already been used in the campaign at this point, and one malfunctioned.
Humanitarna intervencija je ubila u Nišu u jednom danu 15 ljudi.
The bomb in Niš was not the only one that went astray that day. In Belgrade, NATO bombed the Chinese embassy, mistaking it for the headquarters of an arms smuggling company, and they killed 3 Chinese. The CIA blamed an out-of-date map. The Chinese didn't believe it. And President Yeltsin made the most of it.
Пусть только Клинтон чуть-чуть нечаянно ракету пошлет. тут же будет возмездие. Немедленно.
The French president, alarmed that the Russian-American peace effort would be stopped in its tracks, invited himself to Moscow.
L'arrivée a été fraîche. Il n'était pas content. Il n'était pas de bonne humeur.
Le président Yeltsin, sur un mode à la fois solennel, mais aussi furieux, a expliqué que ce qui s'était passé, c'est-à-dire le bombardement de l'ambassade de Chine, créait une situation nouvelle. C'était un acte de barbarie qui menait le monde littéralement au bord de la Troisième Guerre mondiale.
Надо было заканчивать бомбардировки и второе думать о будущем обустройстве Югославии и с тем, чтобы все-таки Россия окончательно не откатилась.
Je lui ai dit, il ne s'agit pas pour nous d'ignorer la Russie, encore moins d'humilier la Russie. Nous savons très bien qu'il n'y a pas d'Europe stable sans une Russie stable.
Yeltsin disait « da, da, da ».
Mais je lui ai dit, vous qui avez résolument engagé votre pays sur la voie de la démocratie et de la modernité.
Et Boris Yeltsin, à ce moment-là, a dit « Et la liberté ?» Oui, a dit Chirac, voilà, c'est ça que tu incarnes.
Ширак уже тогда начал говорить о том, что, мол, да, Милошевич негодяй, да, нужно думать о демократизации Югославии.
Vous, Boris Nikolaevitch Yeltsin, vous associez votre nom avec celui de Milosevic. Vous êtes l'avenir pour la Russie.
Tu peux jouer un rôle en plaidant auprès de Milosevic pour l'arrêt de cette guerre, et nous devons reprendre le travail ensemble. Il faut que lorsqu'on enverra des troupes au Kosovo, il y ait non seulement les troupes de l'Alliance Atlantique, mais à nos côtés, les troupes de la Russie.
Chirac's idea that Russian troops form part of a Kosovo peacekeeping force was just what Yeltsin was angling for. The Russian-American peace effort could now get started.
President Clinton had been very clear, even in the phone call during the NATO summit, that NATO was going to have to be basically in charge.
Я же не нанимался к Телботу в почтальоны. Передавать, что мне Телбот скажет, а я повез его к Милошевичу.
The two peacemakers were so far apart, they needed a mediator of their own. So the president of neutral Finland agreed to join them, on one condition.
Minä jo tunsin Milosevicin vanhastaan ja katsoin, ettei mihinkään tämmöiseen neuvottelutilanteeseen meidän ei pitäisi mennä. Kyllä meidän pitäisi löytää yhteinen näkemys, koska muutenhan voisi pitkittää näitä vaikka tuomiopäivään saakka.
What became known as the Troika had barely got down to work when Talbot got a phone call.
It's happening. The War Crimes Tribunal is about to indict Milosevic.
Sanoin, että mä en oikeastaan tiennyt, olisiko minun pitänyt itkeä vai nauraa. Mä sanoin, että eikö tämä nyt ole ihan riittävän vaikeaa niin kuin se on.
The Troika feared that now Milosevic had been indicted for war crimes, he was less likely than ever to capitulate. If convicted, he faced life imprisonment.
Gospodine predsjedniče, počasna četa garde, postrojena u vašu čast, spremna za službu. Raportira kapetan prve klase.
But Milosevic knew that as long as he remained president of Yugoslavia, he was safe from the International War Crimes Tribunal.
Ja ne priznajem tu instituciju, to je politička institucija koja je deo tog mehanizma rasturanja i uništenja srpskog naroda. Imate li razloga da se bojite? To mi je već pitanje bolje, nemam nikakvo. Mogu mirno da spavam.
Meine Frau konnte niemals verstehen, dass die NATO als die mächtigste Militärallianz der Welt nicht in der Lage ist, das Zentrum des Übels, nämlich Herrn Milosevic, auszuschalten. Sie träumte von James-Bond-Operationen. Er reinkommt und wie man das in den Filmen sieht, den Übeltäter dingfest machen. Ich habe ja erklärt, dass ein Staatsoberhaupt kein Kombattant ist und damit eben nicht wie ein Soldat Ziel militärischer Aktionen sein kann.
The solution was to find a target close to Milosevic that they could claim was legitimate. Beneath his residence was the most secure air raid shelter in Belgrade.
His home had a big communications bunker underneath it, and so we struck at that bunker.
But when the residence was hit, the Milosevic's were away.
A mi smo tek ujutro došli i vidjeli smo porušenu kuću i zaista svoje stvari razbacane neke po dvorištu. I gdje su te zavese bile ovako po vrhovima drveća? Bilo je tu i neke romantike, tako tužne i bolne. Sve je uništeno iz kuće osim što je preživao krevetac našeg unuka.
NATO was finding no quick solutions, and its campaign, supposed to last 3 days, was now entering its 3rd month. The pressure on NATO was growing as key members faced serious political crises over the war. The most vulnerable government was Germany's. At his party conference, the German foreign minister faced an open revolt.
Es war eine furchtbare Veranstaltung. Eine vernünftige Diskussion war nicht möglich. Es ging mit Trillerpfeifen. Dass dieses gegen die Überzeugung vieler in meiner Partei stand, die nie wieder Krieg zu ihrer Grundlage gemacht hatten. Das war kurz vor dem Sprengen der Veranstaltung. Ich bekam Farbbeutel ab aufs Ohr, musste im Krankenhaus das reparieren lassen.
The German Chancellor summoned the 3 men charged with ending the war.
Kansleri Schröders paineet omassa puolueessa ja erityisesti vihreiden puolella olivat niin voimakkaita, että hän näki suuria vaikeuksia pitää omaakin hallituskoalitiota koossa, ja koko Naton koheesio oli kärsimässä tästä.
Worse was in store. The decision to deploy ground troops, fudged at the NATO summit, could no longer be avoided. If the war was to end before winter, the huge logistical operation to prepare for an invasion of Kosovo had to start soon.
Sandy Berger called, and he said, now how long, he said, is it going to take to do the deployment?
General Clark, rather ingeniously, was moving forces into the region, into Macedonia, into Albania, Apache helicopters. I mean, he was putting pieces on the board step by step.
I said, I'll look at it again. I've looked at it in great detail, and I think the date is the 1st of June.
On June the 1st, the Troika reconvened at a German government guest house outside Bonn. The imminent decision on ground troops made their task even more urgent. They decided not to leave until they had agreed all the terms to put to Milosevic.
Mr. Chernomyrdin had in his delegation a Russian general by the name of Ivashov. He said no to everything, every conceivable proposition. NATO at the core, no. Total withdrawals, no. You name it, the answer was no.
Выводить одновременно все силы безопасности, и вооруженные силы, и пограничные силы, это нецелесообразно. Нецелесообразно, потому что немедленно хлынут туда боевики с оружием.
И мы убеждали господина Телбота и его там соратника, он там постоянно на телефоне был с своим руководством, что они, мы им говорили, что вы не сможете ввести, можно 30, 50, 150 тысяч. Все равно это сделать невозможно. Лучше это если будут сами делать югославы.
At the end of the day, the disagreement between us was going to come down to one 3-letter word. All, A-L-L, which happens also to be a 3-letter word in Russian, V-S-E. So the only way to create what is called a secure environment in Kosovo is to get all of the Serbs out. That meant all of the Serb armed forces, all of the paramilitary, all of the special police. Out, all of them, every one.
They took a break so that Chernomyrdin could phone Moscow and report that the Americans would not budge from the word all.
Виктор Степанович проинформировал о том, что НАТО будет жестко стоять на полном выводе сербских войск из Косово, и дальнейшая позиция вести переговоры на этих условиях ни к чему не приведет, только затянет военную эскалацию.
When they resumed the next day, the Americans got a pleasant surprise.
The Russians had a laptop computer on the table where we were negotiating, and they kept churning out drafts and counter drafts and redrafts of the paper that Chernomyrdin was prepared to take with him. And all of a sudden that morning, the three-letter word popped out, ALL.
Chernomyrdin ilmoitti, että hän hyväksyy, ja välittömästi sen jälkeen kenraali Ivashov sanoi, että hänellä ei ole mitään valtuuksia hyväksyä tätä.
Были нарушены российские интересы, ну и другие вопросы, по которым я не согласился. Было проигнорировано мнение военных трех сторон.
Я не с ним должен был советовать, он мне помогал, помогал и говорил там все, что касается военных дел. Оно ни в коем случае не политических дел. Для этого у меня был президент, премьер, министр. Вот это все.
What the Russian general did not yet know was that Chernomyrdin had been instructed by their president and prime minister to play for higher stakes, to gain Russia a foothold in Kosovo.
Venäläisten tavoitteena oli saada oma sektori Kosovossa, joka olisi ollut heidän kontrollissaan. Ja se olisi lähinnä ollut se maan pohjoisosa, jossa oli serbien enemmistö.
If you had a Russian sector within Kosovo, it would automatically attract Serbs, and particularly the more militant and violent Serb elements who would want to get in under the Russian umbrella.
Американская сторона действовала неконструктивно, пыталась выбросить Россию из процесса урегулирования.
The reason we didn't feel we had to resolve that in the Petersburg talks because it was none of Milosevic's business. What we had to get Milosevic to agree to was get all his people out.
Niin siinä vaan periaatteessa viittasi kintaalla tähän kenraalinsa lausuntoon. Tämä on hyväksytty. Me olemme valmiit lähtemään Belgradiin.
They were setting off for a country that had suffered 9 weeks of bombing.
Tamo da je štetno, tamo da je zagađeno, ali ljudi nemaju izbora pa moraju da piju.
Growing shortages were taking their toll. The people's tolerance was becoming strained, even in Serbia's most loyal heartland. For over 600 years, the town of Kruševac had been known for its patriotism. In 1389, men from here had marched south into Kosovo to do battle against the infidel. In 1999, the tradition lived on.
Kruševac zbog blizine Kosova, zbog zone odgovornosti u vojnom smislu je imao svojih dragih oko 11.000.
Trouble began here when the bodies of 4 local soldiers were brought back from Kosovo to the town's main hospital.
Se pročula vest da su 4 rezervista poginuli, da su njihova tela u kapeli. Ja sam te noći radila, ta vest je čula tako negde oko 7-8 sati i ja sam jako bila uplašena. Znate kako, kad imate sina i brata rođenog na Kosovu, vrlo je teško podneti takvu jednu vest.
Te su vesti kružile od jednog do drugog, dodavalo se nešto, povećavalo se, kaže se stiglo je u kapelu 4 leša, onda neko doda nije 4 nego je 40, onda neko doda nije 40 nego je mnogo više.
As the rumor spread, a crowd of some 2,000 people, mostly women, gathered on the town square. They went looking for the mayor. They finally tracked down the mayor.
Gradonačelnik je na veliki pritisak demonstranata, na gađanje zgrade u kojoj je on bio.
Zvižduke, povike, urlanje, kad sam se ja pojavio. Jer svestan da tog momenta ne mogu ih uveriti u istinu.
Da ga jednog trenutka milicija, bojeći se da ga ne povredimo, jer su zaista letele kamenice i to malo veće, obgrlila i vratila nazad u zgradu.
Similar protests broke out in 2 nearby towns. Milosevic became so alarmed that he sent his top soldier to calm down the women.
Takvo jedno nezadovoljstvo naravno bilo je prisutno i u Kruševcu i ja sam obavio razgovor posebno sa roditeljima vojnika, da je najviše bilo majki naravno koje su brinule za svoje sinove.
A onda smo mi njemu postavljali konkretna pitanja kad će rezervisti da dođu sa Kosova.
Ja sam obećao da ćemo mi omogućiti da se oni vrate, da se odmore, da se izvrši zamena jedinica.
Nismo ni verovale.
Rumors of the protests soon reached men from Kruševac serving in Kosovo. More than 1,000 of them hijacked military vehicles filled with weapons and headed for home.
Naš oficir je došao i stao ispred samohodke i nije dao da krene, kao zgazite mene. Ja sam došao i rekao sam mu slušaj, i ubiću i tebe i sebe, skloni se bolje, hoće da idemo.
The chief of staff intercepted the mutineers a few miles from Kruševac.
Kad smo objasnili tu situaciju, ja sam preduzeo mere da se ne preduzime nikakve represivne mere, mada je, kao što znate, bilo proglašeno ratno stanje.
Nego sam sa dijelom svoga ljudstva se vratio dole na Kosovo i bio sam dole 3 dana, još 3 dana da bi me onda došli uhapsili i nabili bi me u lipljan pritvor. Zajedno sa Vučkama, zajedno sa mojim neprijateljem do kojim sam se juče borio. Juče sam se borio s tim ljudima, a sad u istoj ćeliji sam bio. Apsurd i sramota.
The mutiny was contained, but it was a warning that the Serb people had a breaking point. Would Milosevic heed the warning? Milosevic had risen to power by exploiting popular support for Serb nationalism. "78 days of bombing had weakened that support. As he prepared to greet the Troika, he knew the terms they would bring could only be humiliating. Could he salvage enough to keep the Serb people behind him and stay in power? As Cherno Mirdin landed in Belgrade, NATO was making no secret of its preparations for a ground war. The proposal the Troika brought was virtually an ultimatum dictated from Washington.
С этим документом приехали. Впервые тогда и Ахтисари приехал со мной, прилетел, точнее, в Белград, или мы на разных самолетах здесь. Вот. И тогда предъявили этот документ Милошевичу и всему его окружению, которое было на этой встрече.
Siinä oli selvästi tämmöisen ultimaattumin makua, mutta se piti yrittää esittää sillä lailla, että tämä oli paras neuvottelutulos, mihin me olimme pystyneet näissä neuvotteluissa, kolmikantaneuvotteluissa.
Milosevic was promised that the proposed peacemakers would not carry the NATO banner.
Pri čemu je rekao da je postigao da sve mora ići kroz sistem Ujedinjenih nacija i da se u svemu tome mora sačuvati teritorijalni integritet ja suverenitet Jugoslavije.
Stenomydin omassa puheenvuorossaan totesi, että tästä seuraa, että Kosovosta tulee autonominen osa Jugoslaviaa. Milosevic. Sanoin, että voisiko hän tehdä jotain parannusehdotuksia näihin. Ja mä totesin, että ikävä kyllä ei. Että...
On je sadržao te garancije i suvereniteta, i teritorijalnog integriteta, i odgovornosti Ujedinjenih nacija za politički proces.
Он взял этот документ и попросил нас, что он его обсудит в правительстве, а на следующий день на Скупщине, то есть в парламенте. И поэтому потом даст ответ. Затем он попросил, ему на это все закончилось.
Ahtisaari and the formal Troika delegation left, not knowing if they'd done enough to make Milosevic back down.
Затем президент Милошевич встретился только с российской делегацией.
А тогда он попросил меня остаться. Мы еще с ним часа 3 переговорили.
Oni su Miloševiću valjda rekli da ukoliko ne prihvati uslove koji su oni tu ponudili, da će doći do te kopnene agresije. Mi smo znali da imamo nekakve šanse da nanesemo odgovarajuće gubitke NATO snagama koje ne bi mogle da podnesu takve gubitke.
Ну, в целом, сама югославская армия, это такая боеспособная армия, с которой нельзя не считаться. Поэтому и он понимал, что если начнется наземное, он и говорит, пусть начнется наземное. Там же было бы море крови.
Černomyrdin je sklonio stvari sa stola, lupio rukom o sto i rekao, draga gospodo, ako ne prihvatite ovo što vam se nudi, Srbija će biti ravna kao ovaj sto ispred nas.
И, конечно, мы ему говорили, что имею в виду, что если это дальше будет, в итоге там действительно никакой победы не будет. Там просто уничтожат страну людей.
Ali da smo mi tada odbili taj njihov zajednički predlog, oni bi onda mogli slobodno da kažu, evo i Rusiji i ruskom predlogu su rekli ne, to znači da je reč o zemlji, o narodu koji se ne može ni na kakav način urazumiti, jer zamislite, čak ni ruski predlog.
Parliament duly approved Milosevic's decision. The war was over. President Ahtisaari reported to the German Chancellor, who welcomed him with delight. The settlement had come just in time to save his government. All the NATO leaders heaved a sigh of relief that bombing alone had brought Milosevic to heel.
Is the peace process, the withdrawal of the Serb troops and the other matters proceeding on schedule today?
The Serb forces are withdrawing. They're withdrawing in a fashion that appears to our commanders to be consistent with their commitment to be gone in the 11-day time period.
But what President Clinton did not know was that the Russians and Milosevic had a secret plan to secure their own slice of Kosovo.
Рассчитывали, что Россия должна иметь свой сектор. Мы рассчитывали на то, что этот вопрос будет обсуждаться. Нам это, кстати, было обещано.
The day before the Serb forces were due to withdraw from Kosovo, the British general in charge of the force that was to replace them reported a hitch.
Mike Jackson called and said he didn't want to go in on Friday, June 11th. The Serbs had asked him, could he delay for an additional day.
They were not going to be in a position to start their withdrawal the following morning, just on organizational terms, not in any sort of sinister or backtracking or any of that.
The Serbs' real reason for delaying the NATO deployment was to let Russian troops get to Kosovo first, to secure their sector.
Bio zadatak od tadašnjeg predsjednika Miloševića da prihvatimo negde na komunikaciji između Kuršumlija i Prokuplja ruski kontingent i da obezbedimo da on dođe do 24 da stigne u Prištinu. Veliki broj jedinica, zakrčeni put, zakrčeni pomoćni putevi, veliki broj civila koji se pomešao sa vojskom.
As I got ready to go to the NATO video teleconference, a note was handed to me. It said the Russians are crossing the Drina, preparing to cross the Drina River.
This time, NATO found itself facing a ground war it hadn't planned for.
Morning.
The Secretary-General's notes record the moment the truth hit them.
Cree que los rusos habían acordado todo esto con Milosevic, que esto es que vamos a la partición de Kosovo, teme que vayamos a la partición.
And I said, don't you think we need to look at a military response? He said, absolutely.
Tomamos la decisión de que las tropas de K4, que estaban al mando del general británico Jackson, empiecen a ir hacia Pristina también lo más rápido posible.
We got official instructions to look at denying the Pristina airfield to that Russian force.
So very confusing fact situation, a Russian leadership situation at that stage, very, very frayed. And we're suddenly in a situation where our fear was, after 78 days, we would wind up with a partitioned Kosovo, which was precisely what we'd fought this war against.
Moscow was clearly up to something. Clinton's Russian advisor was sent there to confront the Russian foreign minister.
Ivanov said that he regretted to inform us that there had indeed been an accidental deployment of Russian forces into Kosovo, but that it was an accident and they would be out in a matter of hours.
So contrite was the Russian foreign minister that he agreed to phone a statement to CNN.
В связи с сообщениями о появлении в Приштине российских военнослужащих, должен заявить, что, к сожалению, это имело место. Причины выясняются. Военнослужащим приказано незамедлительно покинуть Косово до получения дополнительных указаний.
Иванов, да, потому что он дипломат, он ведет переговоры, и он ничего не знает.
As early as he dared, the foreign minister woke his colleagues.
И он мне сказал, что надо сейчас встречаться с Ельциным, будет решать все вопросы.
The foreign minister now learned that his president had been behind the whole operation.
Мы вместе готовили записку, проект записки президенту Российской Федерации с оценкой сложившейся ситуации, с правомерностью наших возможных действий по вводу, самостоятельному вводу.
Борис Николаевич был в хорошем настроении, и он как бы сам сказал, внушить, что о, как мы здорово дали, заехали в Приштину. На что Иванов сказал, все, конечно, здорово, а что будем дальше-то делать? Потому что ситуация была вот такая, на самом деле, очень серьезная.
И были, естественно, какие-то опасения, чтобы не возникли инциденты.
Ну, что надо было сохранять мину, хорошую мину при сложной игре. Я не хочу сказать при плохой, при сложной игре. Мы не могли же говорить, что Квашнин взял да ввел туда батальон, а Борис Николаевич его поддержал.
They decided to raise the stakes and send reinforcements to Pristina airport.
We were getting information reports that the Russians were loading aircraft. In fact, it was on Moscow television, apparently, showing pictures of airplanes and paratroops boarding aircraft and so forth.
NATO was put on standby. The commander of the Kosovo force was ordered to prepare to block the runway at Pristina airport by landing helicopters there.
The force was given a warning order. We went on to 15 minutes notice to move.
The British general was concerned that what he had been ordered to do was dangerously confrontational. His boss flew to Kosovo to talk him round.
He said, I won't do it. I won't do it. I won't send the Apaches up there to block those runways. You don't have the authority to order me to do this. This is not part of my mission. I'm not going to do this. And I'm not taking any more instructions from Washington.
My authority is quite clearly defined, both in task and ability to change those tasks and missions.
The British government backed their general. Clark was ordered to abandon the plan to block the runways. NATO had urgently to find another way to stop the Russians.
A very tense moment. I would say this is one of the tensest moments in U.S.-Russian relations in the last 10 years, where we actually were close to a confrontation.
To reach Kosovo, the Russian Air Force had 3 possible routes. They could fly over Hungary, Romania, or Bulgaria, all former members of the Soviet bloc. The Russian Air Force contacted its Hungarian counterparts and received permission to overfly. It looked as though President Yeltsin had pulled it off. But now NATO deployed a formidable weapon, the telephone.
So we called through every channel possible, and probably multiple channels simultaneously, telling them not to give the Russians clearance over their airspace.
Hungary had just joined NATO, and NATO's strategic interest was pointed out to them. They reversed their decision. Romania and Bulgaria had applied to join NATO. They too refused Russia permission to overfly their territory. Although the Russians had secured Pristina airport, with no means to fly in reinforcements and supplies, their triumph was short-lived. Moscow had gambled and lost. Milosevic came out empty-handed, with Kosovo under international control and no Russian sector for the Serbs to dominate. All the Milosevic family had to offer the Serb people was Bambi Park, son Marko's latest business venture, which his mother opened soon after the war. Milosevic, the indicted war criminal, now presided over a bomb-damaged and bankrupt country. But he was safe from the international tribunal as long as he remained president of Yugoslavia.
And the series concludes at the same time next Sunday night here on BBC Two.